Some of my favorite tools to actually play with these days are some of these AI chatbots, these AI chat assistants. If you need to do some writing or some programming or scripting, whatever it happens to be, or if you just need some quick information, maybe instead of doing a Google search, you'll just ask ChatGPT or Llama or whatever AI, Gemini, whatever AI service that you prefer. And it has gotten to the point now where I find myself on a daily basis, at least once a day, I probably am going to one of these AI chat assistants to ask them a question. Like, it's become part of my normal daily routine. And one of the things I wanted to talk about today was some tips and tricks that you can use when you're interacting with these chatbots. So let me jump into my browser. So I use the Brave browser, and I often, while I'm using Brave, will pull up their Leo chat assistant. I have that binded to where if I want a little pop out on the side, I can do Control I, to toggle it off. I also have Control Shift I just to open full screen the Leo AI. And of course, you can choose what large language model you want this to use. In my case, I prefer using Llama. So let me zoom in a little bit here in the browser just to make sure you guys can see all of the text that I'm going to type here. So the very first tip I want to give you is tailor your prompt and specify your target audience. So when I say tailor your prompt, tell the chatbot how it should act. Give it a personality, give it a persona. And then when you're specifying the target, tell it the kind of audience that it's speaking to, how the output, that it creates. Tell it if it's a older audience, a younger audience, if it's an audience that actually knows the subject, or an audience that's completely new to the subject. Really specify that prompt and that target audience. So let me give you an example here. Let me go ahead. I'm going to do a copy and paste here. I hope you guys can read this. Let me zoom in a little more just to make sure that you guys hopefully can see the text here. So the very first line here, I did persona : now this is just for me and for purposes of this video, so you know what this line is. I could have left that word out, but it's good to put it there. The chatbot will know what I'm getting at here. I'm basically telling the chatbot, your persona is to act like a financial professional. That's what I wanted to do in this example. And the goal here is to explain cryptocurrency to a group of high school students. So these are not going to be really highly educated individuals, especially when it comes to blockchain technology and cryptocurrency. And then the context, just to give it a little more detail, I added a third little line here. Provide an overview that includes key principles, but avoids overly technical jargon. Because again, it's speaking to a group of high school students. I don't want the output to be too complicated. So again, if you were, for example, if I'm a teacher or I'm speaking at a group of high school students and I'm giving a presentation on cryptocurrency and I'm trying to ask this chatbot to help me, give it these details. Otherwise, the output that it creates could be totally inappropriate for the audience you would be speaking to. So if I give it all of that, let's see what it comes up with. And it's going to give me a pretty nice little detailed list here. We've got some key principles and some bullet points, and just looking at the words here, nothing is overly technical as far as the jargon. It does explain this in rather simple terms. It really doesn't get into the details of the technology at all. So this was exactly what I wanted. Another thing you can actually do with these chatbots is you can encourage them to ask you questions, especially ask you clarifying questions. So it doesn't have to necessarily be you always leading the conversation. Sometimes you can get it to move the conversation forward. So let me do another example here. This time I'm going to do a persona where I tell the chatbot to act like a successful entrepreneur. And your goal is to generate an example business plan for the launch of a company's new product. And I give it a context here. The product is a new type of coffee pot that is versatile and affordable. Ask me all the clarifying questions that are needed to understand this product and target market. I will answer them for you. And then I feed it that, and it should give me my example business plan. But it's also, as it's going through this list of points here, each one of them does include questions. For example, product name and description. What's the name of your new coffee pot? And can you describe its unique features, right? And target market. Who is your ideal customer? Are they coffee aficionados or busy professionals? So this is great. So it created this business plan, but it asked a million questions when it created this business plan, because these are questions that if this was a real business plan, I would need to know the answers to all of these questions. And if I didn't know the answer to these questions, then I need to figure it out, right? The next tip is, sometimes you can tell the chatbot what kind of persona it wants to use, but give it a style. Sometimes you want it to be serious. Sometimes you want it not so serious. For example, I could do, if I type this out, I could say, act like an insult comic. And then for goal, I'm going to tell it, tell me why I'm a loser for using Linux. Right? I have no idea what kind of response this will have, but okay. And you can say sarcastically, oh boy, you're a real winner, aren't you? And then, we've got a few little jabs and pokes along the way as far as insults. He actually calls me a loser here toward the end. And tip number 4 is don't be ambiguous. So when you're asking for something, really be specific. If you're ambiguous, there's really no telling what the chatbot's going to spit out back at you. And, a lot of times you will waste your time, asking the question too broadly. So really narrow things down. Don't be ambiguous. So here is an example. Here, I'm not going to give it a persona. I'll just let the chatbot use whatever persona it wants. It may still use the sarcastic or insult comic persona, since I didn't specify it not to use it anymore. But now I have the goal of provide a detailed comparison of the central banking systems of the US, UK, and Japan. Wow, that sounds like a complicated subject, right? And that's very ambiguous. I mean, there's a lot to discuss, especially the chatbot is kind of limited on what it's going to output, right? It's going to be a small, condensed kind of overview or summary. So I need to give it a little bit more information. So in this case, context, specifically focus on these aspects for each nation: structure, governance, monetary policy, and inflation target. So I give it 4 things to really focus on, because if I didn't specify that, there's really no telling what the output from this could be. And now we get the central banking comparisons of the UK, US, and Japan, and it breaks it down each country one at a time, and it breaks it down in those 4 categories that I specifically asked for. This is actually really nice. Structure, governance, monetary policy, inflation target for the US, for the UK, and for the Bank of Japan. And then finally, we get key differences at the end, as well as a conclusion. Tip number 5 when using these chatbots is sometimes you're going to need more information, because it is limited on the output that it can spit out at a time, but you can keep asking it for more and more, and it will keep writing on the topic. So if this is not quite long enough for whatever you needed for an article or a blog post, whatever it happens to be, just tell the chatbot to continue. Give it a second, and it's going to go into more detail. Now, once it's finished with this block of text, if you need even more information, again, don't be afraid to just tell it to continue. And of course, all of this, I was asking information for potentially articles or books or whatever it happens to be. This was all just actual writing. But what if you were scripting or programming? It's the same thing. When you're asking your questions, don't be ambiguous. Tell it exactly what you want. If you need clarification, ask for clarification. If you need it to ask you questions, tell it to ask you questions. Let's actually do an example, because I actually use this particular chatbot using the Llama large language model. I use it all the time for scripting questions. For example, how can I pull out all of the fields except the first and third using the awk command? We really just threw it a curveball, because we haven't been asking programming questions, but I gave it, this question, and you can see, it gives me an example, awk print the second column and the fourth column. Okay, that skips the first and the third, and that's assuming it only has 4 fields. But let's assume I really didn't know how to use awk or whatever, and I'm going to the command line, and as it's giving me this command, I go and test the command, and it's not quite what I wanted. Maybe the file, instead of using spaces as the separator, which awk defaults to using spaces as the separator, maybe it uses colons. So can you make it use colons as the field separator? Wow, I am terrible at typing. You know what? I'm not even going to correct that, because let's see if it actually figures out, because that is really bad typing. That's bad spelling in that. But it actually knew what I was asking, and it did give me the correct command. And then typically when you're asking these questions about scripting and programming, you're going to keep telling it to modify the command, modify the command. I'm going to say, hey, can you feed that into FZF, the fuzzy finder tool, right? And now it should give me an example of using this in conjunction with fuzzy finder. And there you go. You just keep building on what you're asking. You just slowly build it, and if you come across something that's not quite right, let the chatbot know, because especially with scripting and programming, because I play with this enough, I know, like, 90% of the time it's going to give you good stuff, but there's like 10% of the time it's going to give you commands that don't make any sense. Maybe you didn't ask the question specifically enough. It's going to give you some commands that don't do exactly what you were looking for. It may do totally the opposite of what you were looking for, or it may just have errors. It may be a command that actually just doesn't do anything at all. So you will run into that, if you're going to ask it programming and scripting questions. And really, when we're talking about writing articles and blog posts and things like that, make sure you're familiar with the subject you're asking about it. If you're asking it about something you have absolutely no knowledge of at all, that's dangerous, because you're going to get a lot of false information spit back out at you. So for example, if you're asking it questions about bash scripting, for example, you should know a little bit about bash scripting. That way, sometimes when it spits out commands that don't make any sense, I spot it immediately. That way, especially if it's something that could be potentially dangerous or something that could break my script that I'm working on, I can spot that and save myself a little bit of heartache and time. Anyway, those are just some of how I use these AI chatbots, these chat assistants, for both writing and for scripting and programming. Do you guys actually use these tools? Do you use them on a daily basis like I do? I'd love to hear what you use them for, which AI chat assistants you use. Let me know in the comments down below. Now, before I go, I need to thank a few special people. I need to thank the producers of this episode. And of course, I'm talking about Matt, Steve, Cap, K-Man, Darloff, Lee, Mythos, Urion, Paul, Peace Arch, and Fedora, Realities for Less, Red Prophet, Roland, Wargento, and Ubuntu, and Willie. These guys, they're my highest tiered patrons over on Patreon. Without these guys, this episode that you just watched would not have been possible. The show's also brought to you by each and every one of these fine ladies and gentlemen. All these names you're seeing on the screen right now, these are my supporters over on Patreon, because I don't have any corporate sponsors. I depend on you guys. Without you guys, I couldn't do what I do. If you like my work and want to see more videos about Linux and free and open source software, including large language models like Llama, subscribe to DistroTube over on Patreon. Peace, guys.